thank you everybody for being here today. It's really a pleasure to have this talk and to have these guests. So I will, of course, briefly introduce Professor Wagner, Mark. What I can say is that, well, I had the pleasure of meeting Marcus a long time ago at the University of Warwick, where we were both teaching there together at the time before he went off to Wollongong, Australia, where he's currently Professor of Law and Director of the Centre of Translational Law and Policy. And myself, I came here to HKU. So it's a kind of a reunion for us after many years, but most importantly is something that I'm very pleased for him to be here, because is one probably of the leading international experts that is able to mix wisely problem of geopolitics, international law, trade, and to examine the legal and economic consequences. Marcus' research has a breadth and depth that is actually rarely found in academia in general, precisely for his ability to actually combine these different elements while always keeping us on the track and on the spot, always the timing issue. And today, well, I can go on with all the different activities and also the impact behind academia from courses, from courts, international organizations, and so on and so forth. But, you know, I think I will let you judge by yourself and, you know, enjoy much more the presentation that Marcus has prepared, which is actually going, as expected, to top in a very critical topic globally and of course for the region, Hong Kong. And so, you know, without further ado, allow me to welcome Professor Wagner here, Marcus, and let's pass in the time and let's hear from you your insights. Thank you very much.
So thanks, Giuliano, for this very kind introduction, and for number one, for having me, for these far too kind words. It is a great pleasure to see you after, I think, almost exactly, 7 or 8 years. Of course, stayed in touch over that time, but it's great to be back. And it's great to be in Hong Kong. Now, when Giuliano said, what would you want to talk about? I thought, there's a few things. One of the projects that I lead is a project called Weaponized Trade, or the weaponization of trade relations. But I thought that is sort of almost par for the course. I can happily talk about this in the Q&A if you want. But there's sort of a new logic of trade, and that hasn't just come about via Trump. That will be a bit of a focus of the talk. But there's new logic in town, which is not the kumbaya moment of international relations that I grew up in. So I was born in the mid-70s, came of age academically in the early 2000s. That's what I call the kumbaya moment of international law and international relations. You can see various institutions that come up. That sort of lasts, from my perspective, until the mid-2010s, and then there's at the starting point of a crisis. And I'll go through some of these, and that crisis that many people talk about all the time, I think is real, at least in the trade space, and has real repercussions of how we govern ourselves on a global scale. So without further ado, I'll just get started. So we had this post-Cold War paradigm that I just talked about, that really sort of has at its center point what I would call economic interdependence, that was designed to temper geopolitical rivalry. That's been inverted from our perspective. Interdependence itself is viewed as a source of vulnerability in some corners. You can basically look at various places, but if you really want to look one place, just follow Donald Trump. Not that I suggest that you do that on a large scale. I unfortunately have to, because one of my hats is international trade law, the other hat is US constitutional law, and now the two have met in ways that make my head explode most days. But it's much more seen, this interdependence, as a vector for strategic competition. And we've moved from this logic of efficiency that really governed the way that I learned international trade and international trade law and open markets to a logic of security and strategic advantage. And that's a fundamentally different precept upon which to operate. So what I'll try to do in this presentation is chart a course through this new reality. I don't think the global trading system is collapsing as such, but it's fracturing and reconfiguring along geopolitical and geoeconomic lines. I don't think we'll find stability by just trying to go back to the system that existed and still exists in some ways, by going back to Geneva, but by building new and hybrid frameworks that are much more complicated, unfortunately, than what we had before. I say this, unfortunately, from a governance perspective. If I put my lawyer hat on, that's fantastic because it means much more business and much more billable hours, if you want to look at it from that vantage point. There we go. So the overview is very, very sort of straightforward. I'll first talk about the structural decay of the post-1995 multilateral order. I'll keep that very brief. Then I'll talk about the new toolkit of geoeconomic statecraft, some strategic responses of major trading powers, and then what I would call pragmatic pathways going forward, because we need some way out of this. And at some point, Trump will not be in power. Right? And the question is, how do we then govern ourselves? So the first part is what I call the unraveling of the old order. And the unraveling of the old order, I will put really, really brief. We moved from the GATT years, created in 1947, to the World Trade Organization in 1995. That marks sort of what I would call the apex of a half century of trade liberalization that began previously, but really gets supercharged and accelerated in the 1990s. That through the Uruguay round of negotiations that then culminates in the WTO, that really becomes an actual organization, unlike the GATT, and expands the scope of international trade governance away from goods into services, intellectual property rights, and not only in terms of breadth, expands the scope, but also in terms of depth. It establishes a binding and a much stronger dispute settlement mechanism, which I think is partially a reason for the downfall of the WTO that we're seeing at the moment. I can go into that if you like in the Q&A. But it's very much sort of that, if you think about it from what characterizes the time period 1995 to 2008, 2010, it's really defined by a powerful consensus amongst at least the major decision makers, market liberalization, deepening economic integration, primary engines of global prosperity. That's the narrative that we have at that time. I think that's probably true. And a core assumption was that by bringing major developing economies, most notably China, of course, into this rules-based system, that wouldn't only unlock economic potential, but also encourage convergence towards liberal economic and political order. That was the idea. Now, the cracks in the foundation are coming up fairly quickly. And here I do the run-up to Trump 2.0, because there's a period that's, so if we just think of 2025 going forward, I think we're shortchanging ourselves because there's something fundamentally happening before that. So the run-up and the cracks in the foundation, as I would call it, is a long, slow decline of multilateralism. This consensus that I just described, you can buy that story or not, but that consensus phrase, and I think has a number of ways to think about this. One is we see a complete stalling of negotiations. One of the main core functions of the WTO is a negotiating forum. That forum has completely stalled in the mid-2000s. It never really functioned as well as a legislative forum as it was designed but we basically see nothing happening in Geneva anymore in terms of new agreements. Now, you can come back to me and say, well, there's a couple of things which I would agree. We can talk about the fisheries subsidies agreement. We can talk about a couple of sort of border agreements, but nothing substantially new happens during that time on the legislative front. We then start to see in the mid-2010s the paralysis of dispute settlement. And the paralysis of dispute settlement is very much driven prior to Trump coming into power. I would suggest to you that that has almost, not entirely, but very much to do with Robert Lighthizer, who later on becomes the United States Trade Representative under Trump 1.0. And the reason why I say this is because with this new dispute settlement system comes a power shift away from capitals towards a dispute settlement system in Geneva. And someone like Robert Lighthizer, who practicing lawyer for a long time, head of the trade remedies bar in the United States, is very much against that kind of power shift. He would much rather have a sort of GATT order in which dispute settlement wasn't quasi-binding, but rather leaves a lot of the power in the hands of the capitals and in the hands of politics. That he could then influence by way of being the head of the trade remedies bar, relatively powerful institution in Washington, D.C. That begins, if you will, that appellate body crisis relatively benignly, because the United States doesn't want to extend the term of one of its own nationals. You can sort of say that's on the US. Jennifer Hillman doesn't get a second term. She was seen as ruling too often against the United States. Whether you buy that idea or not is a different question. My own take is, if you are a member of the appellate body or an international judge, you shouldn't necessarily be seen to be ruling in favor of your own country all the time, but there's empirical evidence to the contrary. I can certainly expect that from judges ad hoc on the International Court of Justice, but if you take a dispute settlement system seriously, you don't expect, at least from my perspective, you shouldn't expect someone to rule in your favor just because they hold a particular pathway. The real change begins, from my perspective, in 2016. And the reason why I remember this fairly distinctly, because I had to give a talk in Johannesburg at the time that I called the constitutional backsliding of the WTO. The backsliding has become much, much worse. And at the time, a Korean national was a member of the WTO appellate body, and he was specifically targeted and singled out by the United States for not reappointing him. And no one got reappointed since. And that meant that in 2019, there was no appellate body left. The United States consistently objected to the reappointment. It's not the United States having a veto power in the sense of the United Nations Security Council, but you have to have consensus for decision-making processes in the WTO. And if the United States isn't coming to the table, or one country isn't coming to the table, then that really effectively removes the teeth of what I would call the WTO rules-based international order. When you disable the primary check on unilateral trade actions, it's a deliberative reclamation of policy space and creates the conditions for a much more assertive and ultimately what we then see as security-driven trade policy. We at the same time see Article 21 of the GATT, the national security provision, making a much bigger comeback in ways that we hadn't seen before, and indications in good faith, you can sometimes put a question mark behind that. There's another element that comes to the fore at that particular time, namely the turn to unilateralism and regionalism. Once you see sort of a blockage of the multilateral path, and that started beforehand, you see at the beginning of these regional / preferential trade agreements or these mega regional blocks, right? Whether you think of this as the TPP at the time, that's now become the CPTPP, after the US pulled out in 2017 under Trump 1.0, or whether you think about this as RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, whether you think of it as, from my perspective, I would count into that the Belt and Road Initiative as well. That is very much a turn towards regionalism, unilateralism, and when you look at the sheer numbers on the screen here, you can see that these trade agreements, preferential trade agreements, so away from Geneva, are proliferating considerably. At the time, you see the USMCA replacing NAFTA. Not that it changed very much, but you see all these changes happening at roughly that time. Instruments of strategic influence is what I would call them, going deeper than WTO rules, covering behind the border issues like e-commerce, labor standards, state-owned enterprises. Some people call it, if you're in Europe, it's either called the spaghetti bowl. Here, I would call it the noodle bowl. Yakish Fakwadi called it the termites in the trading system that undermines this multilateral order. But it creates economic spheres of influence, because the standards that are being set in these regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements, oftentimes driven by the EU, China, and the US, create spheres of influence because standards of these major players are then transformed by way of these agreements. Now, the catalyst to all of this is the America First. I'll leave the Biden administration aside, because the Biden administration, while changing the rhetoric, continued the policies. Right? And we see a continuation until Trump 2.0. I think Trump 2.0 is a qualitative difference, but Biden doesn't substantively change the policies. Whether you think about the CHIPS Act or the IRA, it doesn't really make much of a difference. Now, if you then go to post-January 2025, and now I think we're at the end of October, it's only been 9 months. I've been told by friends of mine who know me well that I've gotten a lot more gray hair since then. It's very much an intensification and accelerant of these trends, and very much challenging the tenets of multilateralism to core, as the French would say. I won't go into details about why the Trump administration does this. You can see this here. Revenue tool doesn't work. Negotiation and punishment tool very much does work. The first time I was interviewed in the media was when US military planes were doing repatriation flights to Colombia, which had been happening all the time in civilian planes. But Trump sent military planes, and the Colombian government objected at the time. I received a phone call from the ABC, can you come into the studio? I don't live far away from it, and I said yes. And I was trying to figure out what was going on, called a couple of friends of mine in the process who live in Colombia, and it worked like a charm, if you think about it, for Trump. The president of Colombia says, we don't want this. Trump says 25% tariffs. 25%. That's a bargain in today's world, right? Colombia folds. It has to. It has no power. Right? It doesn't have the power, and is highly reliant on the US. It's a love-hate relationship. I spent a fair amount of time in Colombia. It's a love-hate relationship between Colombia and the US, and between all of Latin America and the US. But the economic reliance is huge. Right? So it works. So the punishment tool, negotiation or punishment tool works. It also seems to be working for reindustrialization, at least sort of in these lighthouse projects. I don't think on a large scale the reindustrialization works, but it's an idea that basically is very much mired in, I don't know, you can go back centuries and centuries if you want, but it's an idea that is also familiar from a country that I grew up in, and I'm a national of, namely Germany, in the 1930s. Autarky is not something that I would recommend as a policy, right? I think it's, and I say this as a German, and I feel very comfortable saying this, it led to the tragedy of World War II, or at least contributed to it. It wasn't the only reason, but it certainly contributed to it. Now, we then see these whole waves of tariffs, which I will not go into, because whatever I would say now in 3 days might be completely different, right? But we see reliance on various legal provisions. Amongst them are the so-called IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is in front of the Supreme Court for various different reasons. We see typical 232, 338, 122, and so forth. But if you think about the fallout, the International Monetary Fund predicted or revised downwards economic growth. Funnily enough, we haven't seen that yet. But I don't suggest you look at the stock market, but rather at the bond market, and the bond markets are much more jittery and a much better indicator. You would know this much better than I do, but a much better indicator of where things are going, I think, in terms of how much confidence, I don't talk about trust, but confidence investors have in terms of lending the US money and how that money might be repaid. The stock market is a different beast altogether from my perspective. And if you look at the US stock market, it's not largely driven by a few companies in terms of, if he nods, I feel very secure, right? But now if you define this new era, right, or before I get there, I can't help this, right? I have to show the penguins. And I show the penguins because this is the Liberation Day tariffs, quote unquote Liberation Day, April 2nd. And I can't help but show the penguins because if you haven't heard about the penguins on Heard and McDonald Islands that no one had ever heard about beforehand, you know about them now. It's an Australian territory in the South Indian Ocean that no one lives in. Only penguins basically hang around. They also got hit with a 10% baseline tariffs because someone used a list of territories and just inserted it into a table, into a weird formula that has no basis. And in the end, you can see that Heard and McDonald Island penguins were also hit by tariffs. But on a more sort of serious note, this new era, I think, is defined by the ascendancy of, I think, two new analytical frameworks. Geopolitics, I think, is relatively straightforward. Sort of a traditional study of how geography and power balances and influences state relations, mostly with a focus on military and territorial competition. That's a relatively standard way of thinking about this. Geoeconomics, in contrast, and I'd be remiss to say to not at least mention the fact that I'm one of the editors of a journal called Law and Geoeconomics. Is the strategic use of economic instruments to achieve geopolitical objectives. Right? So we're now seeing the fact that countries, we've always seen it a little bit. Right? So we've seen trade relationships being used, but they've rarely been used coercively in the same way that we're seeing that today. And that's not just the US. I think it's other countries as well. I would include China, I would include the European Union as well. It's sort of the application of power politics by economic means is a short definition that I would use. Economic interdependence isn't a restraint on conflict, but a tool of statecraft. So just a plain tool of statecraft, which states leverage in financial networks, supply chains, technological ecosystems, and coerce or influence other actors. And this is sort of a hybrid form of statecraft where the distinction between economic welfare on the one hand and national security has been deliberately blurred. Now, what is this geoeconomic toolkit that I'm talking about? I would say the first one is the return of industrial policy, and that has started under the Biden administration, very much so in the US. It takes place almost everywhere now. It used to be seen as a relic of a bygone era. Dramatic return, from my perspective, to the center of economic strategy in the world's major economies. Shared recognition is one of the driving forces that major market forces alone, or the market force alone, can't be relied upon to secure national interests. And the primary goals here is to build domestic capacity in critical sectors, ensure supply chain resilience, and establish leadership in technologies of the future. Again, I don't single any country out here. If you think about this, this is something that China has very much done from quite some time ago. And I think other countries are realizing that this is something that they might have to jump on the same bandwagon, simply because of the economic might that China has in the meantime acquired. It's not an allegation, it's just, I think, an observation of what's happening at the moment. Now, if you look at this from a country-by-country perspective in some sense, I've just picked out a few here. The obvious candidates are the United States, China, and the European Union. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can sort of see the Made in China 2025 document, the dual circulation strategy, see the IRA and the Chips and Science Act, the European Chips Act. They're all sort of the same ilk, right? And that's something we wouldn't have seen 10, 15 years ago. Or go back to 2005. That was not in the offing. It just wasn't a tool that we would have used. You can look at the stated goals and the primary instruments. I'm not going to go through them bit by bit. It's just, I think most of you will be familiar with this. There's an element, however, that comes on top of that, which is subsidization that goes along with that. And that creates a very challenging dynamic. If you think about it, one nation's or one country's effort to secure its supply chains is oftentimes perceived by another as a protectionist measure designed to capture market share. And that's a very stark sort of deviation of the leitmotif of the WTO of 1995. That had a completely different logic to it. That's the new world that we're living in. That perception then justifies retaliatory policy responses, creating feedback loops that are fairly complicated of escalating state intervention and market distortion. Now, the second one is a race, what I would call a race for technological sovereignty. If states can control their own quote unquote digital destiny, which encompasses data, hardware, software, then that's the new era that many countries strive towards. And you can see this again. I think Trump just accelerated this phenomenon, but the European Union is desperately trying to sort of scale up its technology stack. Desperately trying to do this. From a period in which there was a reliance on the US because you trusted, and I think trusted was the right word, you trusted the US as a partner. That trust is gone. Ask the Canadians, right? That trust is gone. And so it's a direct response to a realization that globally integrated digital ecosystems create national security vulnerabilities because someone could turn it off. Ask the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. I don't know whether you've heard about this, but their access to Microsoft Office was simply cut off. It's really that simple. Right? So then you can look at various different models. The EU's model is sort of the classic EU regulatory model, which I'm frankly a big fan of. I don't mind. I nail my European colors to the mast. I think it seeks to establish global norms through relatively comprehensive values-based regulation. You can disagree with the values, but it's comprehensive and it's values-based, and we can have that discussion. At least we can then talk about the values. Right? You can look at GDPR. You could look at the AI Act. Deficient as it is, but at least it's there. Whereas in the US, there's nothing there. Whereas in China, I would say it's far too restrictive and too much state control. So from my perspective, it's sort of the European Union, much as it's boring, is in the middle ground. I'm perfectly happy to be in the middle ground sometimes, right? It looks at digital, at the protection of consumer rights. Big fan, right? The Brussels effect, much as it's been maligned sometimes, I think is not the worst thing in the world. There's a state-centric model that China champions from my perspective. You can tell me that I'm wrong about this. Cybersecurity law, data security law, personal information protection law, they all establish a framework for data localization and government oversight. How much that is and how much people feel comfortable with is up to everyone for themselves from my perspective. There's also an element of exporting, of course. The Digital Silk Road initiative is, I think, a smart move to make. It's an incredibly smart move to make. But the recipient also buys certain advantages, but also, I think, certain disadvantages. And the more we travel down the technology route there, especially when it comes to services, so think about blockchain, the more I think you'll see what I would call a permanent X-ray capability into what's happening in different countries. I can go into that later if you want. Then you have the US's so-called market-driven model, hands-off, market-led approach, which lots of people, of course, like, because we've all been told that's the way to go. If I look at it at the moment, I'm much more scared because of the stark influence or the strong influence of certain people in Silicon Valley in that process. Now, let me go to the choke points. The choke points are relatively straightforward. Think about semiconductors. And the US-China semiconductor war, the United States implements a relatively comprehensive and unprecedented set of export controls to cripple China's ability to produce or acquire high-end semiconductors. That's not only the chips themselves, but also manufacturing equipment, software, and so forth. And even people from the US traveling to China to support the facilities. Very much impacts not only China, but also US firms. Think about NVIDIA, barred from selling its top-tier chips to China. Its market share at the time plummets from over 90% to virtually zero in China. Right. That's a chip war if ever there is one. China retaliates because it has the capacity to block critical supply chains like gallium, germanium, and a range of rare earth elements that we're talking about at the moment. On the back of that, you see what just happened last week. The US is making an agreement with Australia on exactly trying to shore up supply chains elsewhere, right? So this is the reconfiguration that I was talking about before. Rewiring the world is really, rewiring the world is really, there we go. The question of how do we reconfigure the supply chains. There's the old adage of, if you think about it, of just-in-time efficiency. We both lived in the Midlands. A Jaguar Land Rover is famous for having just-in-time. Then Brexit came, and I told the the UK government at the time, you do realize that this is not going to work anymore because this one part of the engine is crossing the channel 3 times. And every time it crosses now, it'll be stuck somewhere in a truck, waiting for paperwork to be done. That is going out the window, if you will. The current sort of trade war is not the only reason for that. We have COVID contributed to that as well, to the realization that you want to do what? In the strongest version of that, you have this reshoring / onshoring, bringing manufacturing operations back to the home country. If you think about it from an economic efficiency perspective that the WTO is built on, that's completely anathema to it. But we're seeing this not just in some areas, some small areas, but we're seeing it in much broader areas than before. Then you talk about nearshoring and friendshoring or ally shoring. All of that are terms that have now sort of entered the fray. And that's the rewiring of the world that we live through and will increase prices considerably for consumers and producers of products. I'll keep that just here for now. Part 3 is the strategic responses of key actors in the Indo-Pacific. And here I would just say, sort of, I'll keep this relatively brief because I think we're running a little bit. Yes. Yeah, okay, 10, 15 minutes. Look, the United States is very much pushing for securitization, I would say, and trying to get some countries to align. Thinks that China represents the long-term strategic competitor whose technological and economic rise must be managed. I think that's the way, that's the view from Washington. That leads to the securitization model that says we need to slow China's advance in foundational technologies while revitalizing the US domestic industrial base and strengthening its network of alliances. The last bit is where the Trump administration fails, of course, miserably, because it antagonizes everyone. There are no friends anymore, from my perspective. I mean, apart from Milei in Argentina and maybe Orban in Hungary. Otherwise, the counting of friends is probably on one hand. Well, but Meloni is at least playing the European game a little bit better, and I think is actually, in the end, still a European. Orban, I don't think he is. I think is the difference for me. Now, if you think about this, this push for alignment, you would want to have lots of friends. You would want to have ASML, the manufacturer for the factory, or for the chips, not the manufacturer for the chips, but the blueprints for the chips. You want that to be closely aligned. Well, the Dutch are not closely aligned at this particular point. You would want Japan, South Korea, in terms of export control regimes, to be closely aligned. But again, create significant friction, even if it were to work, and increase prices considerably overall. China, I would sort of characterize as dual circulation fortress and a bit of a revisionist agenda. I don't think dual circulation, by the way, is a move towards autarky or economic isolation, but a strategic rebalancing, very much designed to make China's economy much more resilient in light of what's happening outside, and sort of less vulnerable to external shocks. Internal circulation, on the one hand, I don't need to say this much to an audience here, and then also international circulation, of course, which seeks to secure and diversify access to foreign markets, technology, and critical resources. PRI is probably the most important vehicle to do this. We can talk about what that means for Hong Kong, but I don't have to tell a Hong Kong audience what that means for Hong Kong. I think the European Union is trying de-risking, or is trying to drive a de-risking doctrine. It's caught between two primary partners, similar to Australia. Australia is highly reliant on China for on 30% imports, 30% exports. Similarly, the European Union is highly reliant economically on China, but wants to strategically, or historically and strategically, align itself with the US. And the question is, what do you try to do in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic environment? It wants to de-risk, but not decouple. Right? And that's a tricky road to travel. I think the EU's primary geoeconomic tool is its regulatory power, the Brussels effect. And what Brussels is, I think, starting to, but very slowly starting to understand, that it needs to buttress that with slightly more hard power. I'm not talking military power, but slightly more hard power. Right? And that's difficult simply because the 27 are hard, a lot of cats to herd. Sorry. Then you look at Japan. Japan, I would say, is starting to move towards what I would call proactive realism to shore up its economic security. It's the classic middle power dilemma. It, on the one hand, is deeply economically dependent on China, but again, foundational security alliance with the US, and is starting to move in ways that I don't think most people would have seen themselves move, in terms of also its military or projection of military. It used to be completely self-defense, vision of self-defense for the military. I think that is not gradually, that is changing rapidly, much more so than most people would have thought not long ago. Domestically, you see the Economic Security Promotion Act, and there's now cabinet-level ministries to oversee supply chain resilience. So these are all these kinds of changes that we're seeing. Similarly, South Korea, I think, is even more precariously positioned in this tech war between the US and China. If you think about semiconductor giants, Samsung, Hynix, they basically embody that kind of a contradiction. On the one hand, they rely on US technology and equipment, and Dutch technology and equipment, but they have massive production facilities in China itself. And so trying to, again, walk that tightrope is difficult, because it leaves them vulnerable to pressure from the US and from China. Let me move on and sort of look for the search for stability. You'll get that. Don't take a photo yet, because the next slide is going to be easier to see. There. Now you can take a photo if you want, but I just thought I'd let you know that. Now, if you think about it, what is the search for stability? What are the pathways to a new equilibrium of some sort? And by the way, if you want the slides, send me an email afterwards. I'm happy to share them.
We can put it online.
We can.
If you want.
I'll email them.
Okay.
I'll email them. If you think about it, what does this new pathway, or where could we be headed? I don't think a return to the pre-2017 status quo is feasible or actually desirable. I don't think we can get back to that. If there ever was a kumbaya moment of international relations, it's gone, right? And that system was predicated on a mutual understanding that we just don't have anymore. So what can we do to build resilient, flexible, and a realistic system that can manage the permanent reality of strategic competition? The first one I would say is reforming, not replacing the old order. That would mean reforms of the WTO, restoring a functioning dispute settlement system that actually works. The MPIA is sort of a step towards that, but it isn't really that. From my perspective, really important is to revitalize the negotiating function, but that hasn't really worked, like I said before, even under the best of circumstances. The second one is, and I think the first one is sort of one option that might go along with some of the others, but I don't think it's a very realistic option at this point. I was at the WTO Public Forum in the last few years. It's never been as gloomy as this September. It's literally, so it was reduced from 3 days to 2 days, and that tells you something as well. So that's just the external side. If you cut it by 30%, just simply the time by 30%, that gives a lot of people a lot of time back. But I think having talked to people on the inside of the WTO is very clear also as a message, we just don't have the capacity to do this anymore, partially because the US is withholding funds, partially because it wasn't seen as opportune to just keep going the way it is as an institution. So if you look at the second option, which is fragmentation and power politics, it's a much more flexible and targeted rulemaking. And the big catchword here, I think, is plurilateralism. Sort of this third way between the gridlock of multilateralism on the one hand and the fragmentation of preferential trade agreements. It's a flexible approach. Lots of people like it. Mostly non-lawyers like it because they can talk about this. I'll be done. These sort of agreements or arrangements are nested within the WTO framework and often designed to extend benefits to all WTO members. Now, if you think about this, beyond the preferential trade agreements, you have all these arrangements, as I would call them, which is pretty much everything that the Trump administration has been doing since January. None of them are trade deals. None of them are trade agreements from my perspective. They don't fulfill the requirements of Article 24 from a legal perspective, but they're also almost not worth the paper they're written on because they could be done away with within 5 minutes or 5 seconds, depending on what happens in Washington. But you have these sort of arrangements that looked a little bit like it, like the joint statement initiatives on e-commerce. You had IPAF, all these non-binding things that sort of float in the ether. But on the other hand, this fragmentation and therefore power politics also means that standards diverge. And this is, I think, the thing that most people don't realize. So we could start off with the fact that Hong Kong uses the UK plugs, right? And that I am traveling at the moment for roughly 6 months. That I'm very glad I have one of those multi-converters, but it drives me up the wall that we can't come up with certain standards. Now, if you think about power politics and fragmentation, that's not the standard that worries me. There's lots of other standards, but standards are sort of the underbelly of what makes international trade work. And if you diverge these standards, not only with respect to goods, but digital services, then you have a completely different world. where interactions are no longer possible. So if you think about internet governance and so forth, top-down versus bottom-up, some of these governance mechanisms don't work and won't talk to one another in the way that they are economically efficient. The last one is what I would call a hybrid club governance, multilateral norms with strategic management, which puts sort of the core group of willing countries, whether that's digital trade or climate clubs, they lead on new rules and others may follow. Some of them may opt out. Some version of the WTO at its core. And then you have a lot of strategic dialogues for bilateral strategy. I'll come almost to the end. What can we do to de-escalate and manage competition? One of the pathways is to normalize coordination amongst competition in a much more fluid way than we've had before. So I'm not the biggest fan of Anne-Marie Slaughter's book, A New World Order. You are smirking, Jed, when I said that. But her descriptive part is correct, right? The normative part is where I have a problem with her book. But the descriptive part is correct, namely that governments and government officials have always talked with one another apart from these large conferences, right? And a lot of governance has taken place in this underbelly. That's the type of coordination that will need to happen again. Certainly with respect to climate change, it would be ideal if it happened with respect to pandemic preparedness. Ideally also with respect to financial stability. But again, the vibe check that if I conduct a vibe check at the moment, I'm not sure that we're getting there. Another way to do it is to establish guardrails, sort of risk reduction mechanisms. The biggest guardrail that you can imagine was the phone connection between Moscow and Washington, D.C. during the time of the Cold War. That something, you could pick up the phone, right? There was a movie not long ago, like this week or last week, that came out on an attack on the U.S. Via nuclear weapons. I forget the name on Netflix. That came out on Netflix. That got a lot of reviews. And I was always thinking towards the end, where is the damn telephone to pick up right now at a very high level, right? And I don't know, that's the one thing that I was missing from the criticism of this movie. The third one is the small yard, high fence approach, disciplined, narrowly defined approach to national security. I think that at the moment is really, really difficult. But it's sort of, I think, an idea. So by way of conclusion, I think the logic governing global trade has fundamentally changed. That's what I tried to show you. And this primacy of geopolitics and geoeconomics has been permanently intertwined, I think, with international commerce. And national security is almost driving that process at the moment. I think the world is entering a durable state of managed and oftentimes mismanaged competition, and the search for stability, sometimes called nostalgic for past order, is something that we should somehow go back to. On the one hand, it needs to be pragmatic, but it also needs to be deliberate and trying to construct this new equilibrium. I think the most realistic way forward is this hybrid mechanism that I described. It's much more messy than I would like it to be personally, but I think it's the only realistic way forward. And with that, I'll say thank you and leave it there.
Thank you very much.